Harold Mitchell's weathered fingers shot to his neck at exactly 2:17 a.m., his body jolting awake as if someone had whispered his name in the darkness. The thing that had started 3 weeks ago as what he'd stubbornly called just a damn old man's pimple now pulsed beneath his fingertips with a rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat. Stumbling to the bathroom, Harold flicked on the harsh fluorescent light and leaned into the mirror. What stared back made his breath catch in his throat. The small red bump had swollen to the size of a marble, angry and discolored, but that wasn't what froze his blood. Something was moving inside it, not the fluid shift of a normal infection, but deliberate scratching movement, like tiny fingers clawing at the walls of their prison. Harold watched in horror as the center of the growth seemed to ripple, then contract, as if whatever lived beneath his skin was trying to break free. "Freedom isn't free," he whispered, echoing his father's old war phrase, though he'd never imagined this price. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Harold Mitchell had built half the houses in Millbrook County with these same hands, but at 67 they trembled as he reached for Eleanor's coffee mug, the one he still filled every morning out of habit 6 months after the cancer took her. The kitchen counter held the archaeology of their 46-year marriage. Her reading glasses folded beside yesterday's crossword, half finished. The small ceramic rooster she'd bought at their first county fair. Prescription bottles with her name still typed on faded labels. The growth on his neck throbbed as he moved, a constant reminder of the stupid job that had started this mess. 3 weeks ago, he'd taken $500 cash to clear brush at the old Hartwell chemical plant, money he desperately needed after Eleanor's medical bills had drained their savings down to fumes. The property owner, Thomas Brennan, had seemed decent enough, though something about his too clean hands and expensive watch had felt wrong for a man hiring day laborers. Harold touched the wedding band he still wore, spinning it around his finger the way he did when thinking about Patricia. His daughter lived just 20 miles away in Columbus, but it might as well have been 20 countries. She'd become Dr. Patricia Mitchell Reynolds, dermatologist, successful and distant. Their relationship had fractured completely when she'd divorced her husband 2 years ago, and Harold, old-fashioned to his core, had taken the son-in-law's side. "Marriage is work, not something you quit when it gets hard," he'd told her. She hadn't spoken to him since Eleanor's funeral. The irony wasn't lost on him that his daughter specialized in exactly the kind of problem growing on his neck, but pride ran thicker than blood in the Mitchell family. Besides, Patricia had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with her father's stubborn ways. His Veterans Affairs medical claim sat in a stack on the kitchen table, each one stamped "Pending Review" in red ink. 3 months he'd been waiting for approval, 3 months of bureaucratic runaround for benefits he'd earned crawling through Vietnamese jungles in 1969. The VA had a way of making you feel like a beggar for asking for what was promised. Harold pulled his collar up to hide the growth and headed out to his truck. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, his 78-year-old neighbor, waved from her garden where she was deadheading her late roses. She'd been Eleanor's closest friend, and her kindness only highlighted how alone he'd become. "Beautiful morning, Harold," she called, but her smile faltered when she saw his face. Even from 20 feet away, something about him looked wrong. 3 weeks earlier, Harold had driven his rusty Ford pickup down the winding country road toward the abandoned Hartwell chemical plant, $500 in cash burning a hole in his conscience. The October morning had been unseasonably warm, Indian summer clinging to southern Ohio like a lover reluctant to let go. He'd needed that money desperately. Eleanor's final hospital bills had arrived like a second death, each envelope a reminder of how much it cost to watch someone you love slip away. The job seemed straightforward enough. Thomas Brennan, a well-dressed man in his 40s with soft hands and an expensive watch, wanted the brush cleared from around the old plant's perimeter. Environmental assessment, he'd explained, though his eyes had shifted when he said it. Need to see what's underneath all this growth before we can move forward with development. Harold had driven past the Hartwell site countless times over the years, watching nature slowly reclaim the concrete and steel. Built in the late 1960s, the plant had operated for less than a decade before shutting down amid whispers of environmental violations and federal investigations. Local folks had their theories about what really went on there, but small-town gossip was cheap as dirt and twice as unreliable. The work had started easy enough. Harold attacked the overgrown brush with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd been swinging tools since he was 12. Sumac and wild blackberry had grown thick around the chain-link fence, creating an impenetrable wall of thorns and twisted branches. As he worked deeper into the tangle, his machete struck something that rang like a bell, metal buried beneath decades of leaf litter and fallen branches. Clearing away the debris, Harold had uncovered what looked like old drums, their sides corroded and leaking dark stains into the earth. Military markings were still visible on some of them, faded stencils that made his stomach tighten with recognition. He'd seen similar containers in Vietnam, though he tried not to think about those days anymore. Brennan had appeared at his shoulder without Harold noticing his approach, studying the exposed barrels with an intensity that seemed wrong for a property developer. "Interesting," he'd murmured, pulling out a camera and taking several photographs. "Very interesting indeed." Harold had straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove. "You know what these are?" "Industrial waste, most likely. Common enough at old chemical plants." But Brennan's answer had come too quickly, too smoothly, like he'd rehearsed it. "Just keep clearing, Mr. Mitchell. We'll deal with proper disposal later." It was while wrestling with a particularly stubborn section of wild rose that Harold had cut himself. The thorns were vicious, some nearly 2 inches long, and one had caught him just below his ear as he tried to duck under a low branch. The pain had been sharp and immediate, followed by the warm trickle of blood down his neck. "Damn it," he'd muttered, pressing his bandana against the wound. The cut felt deeper than it should have, and something about the way it stung suggested he might have caught more than just a thorn. The disturbed soil around the buried drums had an odd smell to it, not the clean scent of earth, but something chemical and wrong. Brennan had watched him tend to the wound with that same unsettling interest he'd shown the barrels. "You should clean that properly when you get home," he'd said. "Never know what kind of bacteria might be in old soil like this." Harold had finished the job by early afternoon, loading his tools into the truck bed while Brennan counted out 5 crisp $100 bills. The money felt dirty in his hands, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way Brennan had seemed more interested in watching Harold work than in the actual progress of the clearing. Maybe it was the careful photographs he'd taken of everything, the barrels, the disturbed earth, even Harold himself as he'd worked. "Appreciate the work, Mr. Mitchell," Brennan had said, shaking hands with a grip that lingered just a moment too long. "I'll be in touch if we need any follow-up." But follow-up for what? Harold had driven home that day with more questions than answers, the cut on his neck throbbing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He'd cleaned it thoroughly with hydrogen peroxide from Eleanor's medicine cabinet, using the first aid supplies she'd kept organized with typical efficiency. Even 6 months after her death, everything in that cabinet remained exactly as she'd left it, and Harold couldn't bring himself to disturb her system. The wound had seemed to heal normally at first. By the next morning it was just a small scab, easily hidden beneath his collar. Harold had forgotten about it entirely, as he'd focused on more pressing concerns, the stack of medical bills that seemed to reproduce overnight, the insurance companies that spoke in riddles and denials, the Veterans Affairs Office that treated every claim like a personal insult. But on the third day, the scab had started to itch with an intensity that made his eyes water. By the end of the first week, it had swollen into a hard, red bump that felt warm to the touch. Harold had convinced himself it was just an infected scratch, the kind of minor wound that sometimes went wrong when you were his age and your immune system wasn't what it used to be. He'd treated it with everything Eleanor would have recommended: antibiotic ointment, warm compresses, hydrogen peroxide, and stubborn denial. But instead of healing, the growth had gotten larger, angrier, and somehow more alive. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and his mind played tricks on him, Harold swore he could feel something moving beneath the skin. That was impossible, of course. Cuts didn't develop their own heartbeat. Infections didn't scratch at you from the inside. And 67-year-old widowers definitely didn't imagine things moving under their skin just because they were lonely and scared and still talking to their dead wives every morning over coffee. At least that's what Harold told himself as he lay awake at night, listening to the sound of something trying to claw its way out of his own body. 2 weeks after the growth first appeared, Harold finally swallowed his pride and drove to Patricia's dermatology clinic in Columbus. The sleek medical building stood in stark contrast to the crumbling neighborhoods he'd grown up in, all glass and steel reaching toward a sky that seemed farther away than it used to be. He sat in his truck for 20 minutes in the parking lot, watching well-dressed patients come and go, wondering if he belonged in a place this clean and expensive. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, looked him up and down as he approached the desk. His work boots squeaked against the polished marble floor, and he suddenly regretted not changing out of his paint-stained flannel shirt. "I need to see Dr. Mitchell Reynolds," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm her father." The smile faltered slightly. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Mitchell?" "Harold Mitchell." "And no, I don't have an appointment, but this can't wait." 20 minutes later, Patricia emerged from the back office, her white coat pristine and her dark hair pulled into the same severe bun she'd worn since medical school. At 42, she'd inherited Eleanor's sharp intelligence and his own stubborn jawline, though her eyes held a coolness that reminded him uncomfortably of the way she'd looked at him during those final terrible arguments about her marriage. "Dad?" Her voice was professionally neutral, the way she might greet any other patient. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Patty." The childhood nickname slipped out before he could stop it, and he saw her flinch slightly. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." She led him to an examination room without speaking, her movements efficient and distant. The silence between them felt heavier than the growth on his neck, weighted with 2 years of unspoken hurt and stubborn pride on both sides. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, pulling on latex gloves with practiced precision. Harold tilted his head, exposing the angry red mass that had been his shame and torment for weeks. Patricia's professional composure cracked for just a moment, and he caught a glimpse of the little girl who used to bandage her doll's imaginary wounds. "How long has this been present?" Her voice was carefully controlled, but Harold knew her well enough to hear the concern underneath. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Started after I did some brush clearing work." He winced as her gloved fingers probed the edges of the growth. "Figured it was just an infected scratch, but it keeps getting bigger." Patricia stepped back, stripping off her gloves with movements that were a little too quick, a little too careful. The clinical mask had slipped back into place, but Harold caught the flicker of something that might have been fear in her eyes. "I need to run some tests." Bacterial culture, possibly a biopsy. She was already reaching for her prescription pad. "This needs immediate attention." "Just cut the damn thing out," Harold said, echoing the words he'd been telling himself for days. "Your mother always said I was too stubborn to let anything poison me for long." The mention of Eleanor hung in the air between them, like smoke. Patricia's pen stopped moving, and for a moment the professional distance crumbled entirely. "Mom didn't die from stubbornness, Dad." Her voice cracked on the words. "She died because she waited too long to get help. because she was more worried about the bills than her own life, because she thought being strong meant suffering in silence. The accusation hit Harold like a physical blow. He'd spent the last 6 months replaying every decision from Eleanor's final year, wondering if he could have pushed harder, demanded better care, found a way to pay for treatments they couldn't afford. The guilt had been eating at him from the inside, just like whatever was growing in his neck. "I did everything I could for your mother," he said quietly. "Every damn thing." "Did you?" Patricia's composure shattered completely. "Or did you do what was comfortable? What fit with your idea of how things should be? Just like you did with my marriage?" The old wound tore open fresh. Harold had liked his son-in-law, respected the man's work ethic and devotion to family. When Patricia had announced the divorce, Harold had seen it as another symptom of a generation that quit too easily, that discarded commitments like used tissues. "Mark was a good man," Harold said. "Good husband, good provider. You gave up too easy. He was cheating on me for 3 years. Patricia's voice was barely above a whisper. "3 years, Dad. And when I found out, when I tried to talk to you about it, you told me that marriage was work, and I should try harder." The words hit Harold like cold water. He remembered the conversation, remembered his frustration with what he'd seen as Patricia's lack of commitment. But he'd never known about the infidelity, never understood why his daughter had looked at him with such hurt and betrayal when he'd taken Mark's side. "You never told me, because you never asked." Patricia's professional control finally snapped. "You made your judgment, and that was it. Just like you're doing now with this growth, just like you did with Mom's cancer. You decide what's true, and reality can go to hell." Harold stared at his daughter, seeing clearly for the first time how much he'd failed her, how his rigid certainties had blinded him to her pain, just as they'd blinded him to Eleanor's suffering until it was almost too late. "I didn't know," he said finally. "About Mark. About any of it." Patricia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to regain her composure. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Because asking questions might have complicated your neat little worldview." She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm referring you to Dr. Sarah Chen at University Hospital. She specializes in unusual infections and tissue abnormalities. And before you start arguing about the cost, I'm covering it, all of it." Harold's pride rebelled at the offer, but the fear in his daughter's eyes stopped his protest before it could form. This wasn't charity or pity. This was love, complicated and damaged but still real. "Patty, don't." She held up a hand to stop him. "Just promise me you'll go. Promise me you won't let stubborn pride kill you the way it almost killed Mom." Harold nodded, his throat too tight for words. As Patricia printed out the referral information, he noticed something he'd missed before. The slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept glancing at his neck when she thought he wasn't looking. "There's something else, isn't there?" he asked. "Something you're not telling me." Patricia handed him the paperwork, her professional mask firmly back in place. "Just get the tests done, Dad. We'll know more then." But Harold could read the fear in her eyes, the same look Eleanor had worn when she'd first felt the lump in her breast. Some truths didn't need words. They lived in the space between heartbeats, in the tremor of a hand, in the way a daughter looked at her father and saw her own mortality reflected back. As Harold left the clinic, the referral papers clutched in his weathered hand, he finally understood what Eleanor had been trying to tell him all those months. It wasn't about being strong or weak, proud or humble. It was about being honest enough to admit when you needed help, and brave enough to accept it when it was offered. The growth on his neck pulsed with renewed vigor, as if it had been listening to every word. That same evening, Patricia sat in her home office surrounded by medical journals and research papers, her laptop screen casting blue light across her worried face. The official diagnosis she'd given her father, probable sebaceous cyst with secondary infection, felt hollow and inadequate when measured against what she'd actually observed. The growth's unusual presentation, its rapid progression, and most disturbing of all, the subtle but unmistakable sense of movement beneath the skin suggested something far more complex than a simple infected cyst. She'd started her research with standard dermatological conditions, working through differential diagnoses with the methodical precision her medical training had drilled into her. But each possibility fell short of explaining what she'd seen. Sebaceous cysts didn't develop that quickly. Bacterial infections didn't create that kind of organized tissue architecture. And nothing in her 15 years of practice had prepared her for the way the growth had seemed to respond to her touch, contracting slightly when she'd applied pressure. It was the mention of the Hartwell chemical plant that had sent her research in a new direction. Patricia remembered the name from her environmental health rotation during residency, when she'd studied the intersection of toxic exposure and dermatological conditions. Hartwell had been cited in several case studies of occupational skin diseases, though the details had always been frustratingly vague, buried under layers of legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her father. "Appointment scheduled for tomorrow. Thank you." The simple words carried the weight of their entire complicated relationship, his stubborn pride, her hurt feelings, and underneath it all, the love that had survived despite their mutual inability to communicate effectively. Patricia pulled up the university hospital database and began searching for Dr. Sarah Chen's previous research. What she found made her stomach clench with fresh worry. Dr. Chen specialized in parasitic infections and unusual tissue reactions, particularly those related to environmental contamination. Her published papers read like a catalog of medical horrors, case studies of workers exposed to industrial chemicals who developed aggressive skin lesions, mysterious tissue growths that defied conventional treatment. The phone rang, startling Patricia from her research. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. "Dr. Mitchell Reynolds? This is Thomas Brennan. I believe your father recently worked on a property of mine." Patricia's grip tightened on the phone. There was something in the man's voice, too smooth, too careful, that immediately put her on guard. "What can I do for you, Mr. Brennan? I understand Harold may be experiencing some health issues related to his work at the Hartwell site. I wanted to reach out personally to ensure he receives the best possible care." The offer was generous, almost suspiciously so. Patricia had seen enough medical malpractice cases to recognize when someone was trying to control a narrative before it could develop into something damaging. "That's very thoughtful," she said carefully, "but my father's medical care is well in hand." Of course. But if you need any information about the work site, potential exposures, anything that might help with diagnosis..." Brennan's voice trailed off, leaving the offer hanging in the air like bait. "What kind of exposures should we be concerned about?" There was a pause, just long enough to suggest Brennan was choosing his words very carefully. "Industrial sites can contain all sorts of residual contamination, heavy metals, organic compounds, biological materials. Nothing immediately dangerous, you understand, but sometimes sensitive individuals can have unusual reactions." Patricia's medical training kicked in, her mind cataloging the symptoms that might fit with various toxic exposures. But something about Brennan's explanation felt rehearsed, as if he'd given this speech before to other concerned family members. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Brennan, but I think we have everything under control." "Of course. But, Dr. Mitchell Reynolds, if I may, your father struck me as a proud man, the kind who might be reluctant to seek help even when he needs it. Military background, if I'm not mistaken." The accuracy of the assessment was unsettling. How much did this man know about her father? And why was he so interested in Harold's medical condition? "I really should go," Patricia said. "Thank you for calling." One more thing, Brennan said quickly. If your father mentions anything about unusual symptoms, sensations of movement, changes in the affected tissue, anything like that, please don't hesitate to contact me. I may have information that could be helpful. The line went dead, leaving Patricia staring at her phone with a growing sense of unease. Brennan's call had ostensibly been about concern for her father's health, but it felt more like intelligence gathering. The specific mention of sensations of movement was particularly troubling. How could he know about symptoms she hadn't shared with anyone? Patricia returned to her research with renewed urgency, expanding her search to include military contractors and biological research programs. The Hartwell chemical plant, she discovered, had been more than just an industrial facility. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, it had operated under several government contracts, conducting research that remained classified even decades later. The few available documents painted a picture of a facility involved in biological weapons research, developing both offensive and defensive capabilities for use in Southeast Asia. There were references to novel delivery systems and controlled biological agents, phrases that made Patricia's medical training rebel against their implications. A knock at her door interrupted her research. Patricia opened it to find Mrs. Dorothy Chen, her father's elderly neighbor, standing on the doorstep with a casserole dish and a worried expression. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," Mrs. Chen said. "I've been concerned about your father. He's been looking poorly lately, and I thought perhaps you should know." Patricia invited the older woman inside, grateful for any information about her father's condition. Mrs. Chen had been Eleanor's closest friend, and her concern carried the weight of genuine affection. "He's been keeping to himself more than usual," Mrs. Chen explained as they sat in Patricia's living room. "Doesn't come out to check his mail until after dark, like he's embarrassed about something. And yesterday I saw him burning something in his backyard. Papers, looked like. Stood there watching them burn for an hour." The image of her father destroying documents sent a chill through Patricia. What could he have that would need burning? And why would he be hiding from neighbors who'd known him for decades? "Mrs. Chen, did my father ever talk about his work in Vietnam, or about the job he did recently at the Hartwell plant?" The elderly woman's expression grew troubled. "He never talked about the war, not even to Eleanor. But lately he's been having nightmares again. I can hear him through the windows sometimes, calling out in his sleep. And there was something else. He asked me if I remembered when the Hartwell plant closed, wanted to know if there had been any accidents or problems." Patricia felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a disturbing picture. Her father's mysterious employer, the unusual growth on his neck, the nightmares and secretive behavior, it all suggested something far more serious than a simple workplace injury. As Mrs. Chen prepared to leave, she turned back with one final observation. "Your father is a good man, Patricia, but he carries his burdens alone. Always has. Sometimes I think that's what's really eating him alive. Not whatever's wrong with his body, but what's wrong with his conscience." After Mrs. Chen left, Patricia sat in her darkened living room, staring at her laptop screen and trying to process everything she'd learned. Her father was scheduled to see Dr. Chen in the morning, and Patricia planned to be there, despite Harold's inevitable protests. Whatever was happening to him, whatever secrets he was carrying, she wasn't going to let him face it alone. The growth on her father's neck might be just the visible symptom of something much larger and more dangerous. And if Thomas Brennan's call was any indication, there were people who knew exactly what that something was, and would go to great lengths to keep it hidden. The emergency room at University Hospital buzzed with controlled chaos as Harold Mitchell was wheeled through the automatic doors, his face pale and clammy with sweat. Patricia had found him collapsed in his kitchen that morning, the growth on his neck now grotesquely swollen to the size of a small egg, angry red and visibly pulsating beneath the fluorescent lights. Dr. Sarah Chen met them at the trauma bay, her dark eyes immediately focusing on the massive inflammation distorting the right side of Harold's neck. At 55, she'd seen enough unusual cases to maintain professional composure, but something about this presentation made her jaw tighten with concern. "How long has he been unconscious?" she asked Patricia, her gloved hands already examining the affected area with practiced efficiency. "I found him about an hour ago. He was responsive but disoriented, kept talking about things crawling under his skin." Patricia's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "His temperature was 103.8 when the paramedics arrived." Dr. Chen's examination was swift but thorough, her fingers probing the edges of the swollen mass with clinical precision. The tissue felt unnaturally firm, almost organized in its structure, and there was an undeniable sense of movement beneath the surface that defied conventional medical explanation. "I need an ultrasound immediately," she called to the attending nurse, "and get me a surgical consultation. This patient needs emergency intervention." The ultrasound revealed what Dr. Chen had feared: multiple cavities within the growth, filled with fluid and what appeared to be organized tissue structures. But more disturbing was the clear evidence of movement, rhythmic contractions that suggested the presence of living organisms within Harold's neck. As the medical team prepared for emergency surgery, Dr. Chen pulled Patricia aside, her expression grave with professional concern and something that looked suspiciously like recognition. "Your father's case isn't the first I've seen like this," she said quietly. "Over the past 5 years, I've treated 7 other patients with similar presentations, all of them veterans, all exposed to contaminated soil from old industrial sites." Patricia felt her stomach drop. "What kind of contamination?" "That's what we're trying to determine. The tissue samples from previous cases showed evidence of parasitic infection, but not from any naturally occurring species. The organisms appear to be genetically modified, designed to remain dormant for extended periods before activation." The implications hit Patricia like a physical blow. "You're talking about biological weapons?" Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "I believe your father and the other patients were exposed to experimental organisms during their military service, organisms that have remained dormant in their systems for decades. Something at the Hartwell site triggered their activation." The surgery took 3 hours. Patricia paced the waiting room, her mind reeling with the implications of Dr. Chen's revelation: Harold's mysterious nightmares, his reluctance to discuss his Vietnam service, the suspicious circumstances surrounding his work at Hartwell. It all pointed to a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple workplace accident. When Dr. Chen finally emerged from the operating room, her surgical scrubs were bloodied and her face was pale with exhaustion. She sat down heavily beside Patricia, pulling off her surgical cap with trembling hands. "We removed 17 separate organisms from your father's neck and upper chest," she said quietly. "They're unlike anything in the medical literature, clearly artificial in origin, designed to feed on human tissue while remaining dormant until triggered by specific chemical compounds." Patricia stared at the doctor in horror. 17? They'd formed a complex network throughout his lymphatic system. If we'd waited another day, they would have reached his bloodstream and spread throughout his body. Dr. Chen's voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father is lucky to be alive." "What triggered their activation?" "Chemical exposure at the Hartwell site. We found traces of organophosphate compounds in his blood, industrial pesticides that appear to serve as activation agents for these organisms. Someone wanted these parasites to wake up, Dr. Mitchell Reynolds. This wasn't an accident." As Dr. Chen spoke, Patricia's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your father's surgery was successful, I trust. We should talk." "The parking garage, level 3. Come alone." Patricia showed the message to Dr. Chen, whose face went white with recognition. You can't go. If these people are willing to use biological weapons on veterans, they won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. But Patricia was already standing, her mind made up. My father almost died because of these monsters. I'm not hiding while they continue to hurt people. The parking garage was dimly lit and eerily quiet, shadows stretching between concrete pillars like fingers reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. Patricia found Thomas Brennan waiting by a black sedan, his expensive suit immaculate despite the late hour. Dr. Mitchell Reynolds, thank you for coming. His voice carried the same smooth confidence she remembered from their phone conversation, but his eyes held a coldness that made her skin crawl. What do you want? Patricia's voice was steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. To offer you a solution to your father's problem, and to yours. Brennan opened a briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope. Complete medical treatment for your father, experimental therapies that can eliminate any remaining organisms in his system, financial compensation for his suffering, and most importantly, his silence. Patricia looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. In exchange for what? Discretion. Your father's case is an unfortunate accident, nothing more. A workplace injury that resulted in an unusual infection. No mention of biological weapons, no congressional investigations, no media attention. Brennan's smile was as cold as winter moonlight. Take the money, save your father's life, and forget this ever happened. And if I refuse? Brennan's expression didn't change, but something dark flickered behind his eyes. Your father's condition is quite unique. The organisms we've developed are remarkably resilient. Even after surgical removal, there's no guarantee they won't regenerate. Unless, of course, he receives the proper treatment. Treatment that's only available through certain government channels. The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Patricia felt a rage building in her chest, white-hot and purifying. These people had turned her father into a living laboratory, infected him with engineered parasites, and now they wanted to buy her silence with the antidote. How many others? She asked quietly. I'm sorry? How many other veterans have you infected? How many families have you destroyed with your experiments? Brennan's smile faded slightly. Dr. Mitchell Reynolds, I think you misunderstand the nature of this conversation. This isn't a negotiation. This is an offer of mercy. Patricia pulled out her phone and showed him the screen, a video recording app that had been running since she'd entered the garage. Every word you've said has been recorded and automatically uploaded to cloud storage. If anything happens to me or my father, copies will be sent to every major news outlet in the country. For the first time, Brennan's composure cracked completely. You have no idea what you're interfering with. National security. National security? Patricia's voice rose in disbelief. You infected American veterans with biological weapons, and you're talking to me about national security? Brennan stepped closer, his hand moving inside his jacket, but Patricia was already backing toward the stairwell. 1 week, Dr. Mitchell Reynolds. You have 1 week to reconsider this decision. After that, your father's medical options become significantly more limited. Patricia ran for the stairs, her heart pounding with adrenaline and fury. Behind her, she heard the sound of a car engine starting, tires squealing against concrete as Brennan's sedan disappeared into the night. Back in the hospital, Harold was awake and alert for the first time in days, the surgical site covered with clean bandages and his fever finally broken. Patricia sat beside his bed, holding his weathered hand and trying to process everything that had happened. Patty? Harold's voice was weak but lucid. What did they take out of me? Patricia looked into her father's eyes and saw not just a sick old man, but a veteran who'd served his country and been betrayed by the very people he'd trusted with his life. She thought about Brennan's offer, about the easy path that would save her father and preserve her own safety. Then she thought about the 17 other patients Dr. Chen had mentioned, and all the veterans who might still be walking around with dormant parasites in their bodies waiting for the next activation. Something that should never have been there, Dad. But we're going to make sure the people responsible pay for what they did to you. Harold squeezed her hand with what strength he had left. That sounds like my stubborn daughter. Your mother would be proud. Outside Harold's hospital room window, the sun was beginning to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of hope and determination. Patricia knew the fight was just beginning, but for the first time in months she felt like she and her father were finally on the same side. The retaliation came swiftly and without mercy. 3 days after Patricia's confrontation with Thomas Brennan in the hospital parking garage, Harold's Veterans Affairs benefits were suspended pending a routine review of eligibility status. The notification arrived by certified mail, buried in bureaucratic language that couldn't disguise its punitive intent. Patricia discovered the letter when she stopped by her father's house to check on his recovery. Harold sat at his kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes from the day before, the official document spread before him like an indictment. His surgical site was healing well, but something vital had gone out of him since receiving the news. 48 years since I got out of the service, Harold said without looking up. 48 years of paying into the system, and now they're saying there might be irregularities in my discharge paperwork. Patricia read over his shoulder, her anger building with each carefully crafted phrase. The letter referenced discrepancies in service records and questions regarding the circumstances of separation from active duty. It was character assassination disguised as administrative procedure. They can't do this, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew how naive they sounded. Of course they could do this. They'd infected American veterans with biological weapons. Manipulating bureaucratic paperwork was child's play by comparison. Harold's phone rang, and Patricia watched her father's face drain of color as he listened to the voice on the other end. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. Dr. Chen's office. My follow-up appointment has been canceled. They're referring me to the VA medical system for continued care. Harold's voice was hollow with defeat. The same VA that just suspended my benefits. The systematic dismantling of her father's support structure was as precise as it was ruthless. Over the next week, the pattern continued. Harold's homeowner's insurance received an anonymous tip about structural irregularities that triggered a mandatory inspection. His part-time job with Morrison Construction was terminated due to company restructuring. Even his credit at the local pharmacy was suddenly called into question. Patricia tried to intervene where she could, offering to pay for his medications and medical appointments, but Harold's pride made him resistant to help. Worse, she began to suspect that her own professional life was being targeted. 2 of her largest corporate clients canceled their contracts within days of each other, citing vague concerns about changing healthcare needs. The message was clear: abandon the investigation or watch everything they'd built crumble around them. Mrs. Dorothy Chen was the first neighbor to distance herself from Harold, though she did so with obvious reluctance and barely concealed fear. Patricia found her tending her garden one evening, her usual warmth replaced by nervous glances toward Harold's house. "I've been told it might be better if I don't visit Harold for a while," Mrs. Chen said quietly, not meeting Patricia's eyes. "Something about potential health risks from his recent surgery. Officials from the health department came by yesterday with very official-looking badges." The isolation campaign was as effective as it was heartbreaking. Within 2 weeks, Harold had gone from being a respected member of his community to a pariah that people crossed the street to avoid. And the whispers followed him wherever he went, speculation about infectious diseases, mental instability, even suggestions that his military service had been somehow dishonorable. Patricia watched her father shrinking before her eyes, not just physically but emotionally. The proud man who had rebuilt half of Millbrook County was becoming a shadow of himself, worn down by the relentless pressure of a system that seemed determined to destroy him. The breaking point came when Harold received a visit from Child Protective Services. Patricia arrived at his house to find a stern-faced social worker documenting the condition of his home, taking photographs of dishes in the sink and outdated medication in his bathroom cabinet. "We've received reports of an elderly individual living in unsafe conditions," the woman explained to Patricia with bureaucratic indifference. "There are also concerns about mental health issues stemming from recent medical trauma." Patricia knew the report was fabricated, just another weapon in the campaign to isolate and discredit her father. But the threat was real enough. If Harold was declared incompetent, he could be placed in state care, effectively silencing him forever. That night, Patricia found Harold sitting in his darkened living room, Eleanor's photograph clutched in his weathered hands. The surgical scar on his neck had healed to a thin white line, but the wounds to his spirit were still raw and bleeding. "Maybe I should just sign their papers," he said without looking at her. "Take whatever deal they're offering and disappear quietly. I'm tired, Patty." Tired of fighting, tired of being afraid, tired of watching them hurt you because of something I did. Patricia sat beside her father on the couch that had been Eleanor's favorite, surrounded by the accumulated memories of a lifetime that was being systematically dismantled. For a moment she almost agreed with him. The easy path stretched before them: sign the non-disclosure agreement, take the money, accept the medical treatment, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But then she thought about Dr. Chen's other patients, the veterans who were still walking around with dormant parasites in their bodies. She thought about the families who didn't know what was coming, who would watch their loved ones suffer without understanding why. "No, Dad, we don't give up. Not now." Harold looked at her with eyes that held decades of pain and defeat. "They're destroying everything, Patty. Your practice, my home, our family's reputation. How much are you willing to lose for a fight we probably can't win?" "Everything, if necessary." Patricia's voice was steady with a conviction that surprised even her. "Because this isn't just about us anymore. It's about every veteran they've used as a test subject, every family they've lied to, every life they've destroyed to protect their secrets." She pulled out her laptop and opened the files she'd been compiling: medical records from Dr. Chen's other patients, environmental reports from the Hartwell site, financial documents linking the facility to various government contractors. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, a paper trail that led directly to the highest levels of military and government authority. "I've been in contact with an investigative journalist at the Washington Post," Patricia continued, "Sarah Morrison. She's been tracking similar cases across the country. Veterans who've developed mysterious infections after exposure to contaminated sites. She thinks we have enough to break the story wide open." Harold studied his daughter's face in the lamplight, seeing something there that reminded him of Eleanor in her most determined moments. "They'll come after us even harder if we go public. You understand that, don't you? Let them come. I'd rather fight this battle in the open than let them destroy us quietly." The decision to move forward felt both terrifying and liberating. That night, Patricia sent her compiled evidence to Sarah Morrison via encrypted email, along with a detailed account of Brennan's threats and the systematic campaign of intimidation they'd endured. As she hit the send button, Patricia felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, father and daughter united for the first time in years by a shared determination to expose the truth. Harold watched her work, and for the first time since his surgery, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said quietly. "She'd be proud of both of us," Patricia replied, "for finally doing what's right, no matter what it costs." Outside, a black sedan drove slowly past Harold's house, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. The watchers were still there, still monitoring, still waiting. But something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. The hunters had become the hunted, and the truth was about to emerge from the shadows where it had been buried for so long. The revelation came not from Patricia's investigation or Sarah Morrison's journalism, but from an unexpected source that changed everything Harold thought he knew about his own life. 3 weeks after the Washington Post story broke, exposing the biological weapons program and triggering congressional hearings, Patricia received a phone call that would shatter the last of her father's carefully constructed defenses. Dr. Mitchell Reynolds, this is Margaret Foster, Eleanor's oncologist. I need to speak with you and your father immediately. There's something about your mother's medical records that you need to know. Patricia found Harold in his workshop behind the house, methodically sanding a piece of oak that would become a jewelry box, something to keep his hands busy while his mind processed the media storm swirling around their story. The congressional investigation had vindicated their claims, but the victory felt hollow when measured against the systematic destruction of their lives. Dad, we need to go see Dr. Foster. She says it's about Mom. The drive to Columbus was tense with unspoken dread. Harold had avoided thinking about Eleanor's final months, focusing instead on their early years together. But something in Patricia's voice suggested that even those memories were about to be tainted. Dr. Foster met them in her office, a small woman in her 60s, whose kind eyes couldn't disguise the weight of what she was about to reveal. Eleanor's medical file lay open on her desk, thick with test results and treatment notes that Harold had never been allowed to see. I should have come forward sooner, Dr. Foster began, her voice heavy with regret. But Eleanor made me promise to wait until after she was gone, and then, when the biological weapons story broke, I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. She opened the file to a series of laboratory reports dated 6 months before Eleanor's death. The technical language was beyond Harold's understanding, but Patricia's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. These aren't cancer cells, Patricia whispered, her medical training allowing her to interpret what Harold could not. These are the same parasitic organisms they found in Dad's neck. Dr. Foster nodded grimly. Eleanor wasn't dying of cancer, Mr. Mitchell. She was dying of the same infection that nearly killed you. The organisms had been dormant in her system for years, possibly decades, until something triggered their activation. Harold felt the world tilt beneath him. Everything he thought he knew about his wife's illness, about their final months together, about the choices they'd made crumbled into dust. That's impossible. Eleanor was never in the military. She was never exposed to sexual transmission, Dr. Foster interrupted gently. The organisms can remain dormant in reproductive tissue for extended periods. Eleanor was infected through intimate contact with you, probably shortly after your return from Vietnam. The implications hit Harold like a physical blow. He had killed his wife, not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly and unknowingly over the course of 46 years of marriage. The woman who had loved him, trusted him, built a life with him, had been carrying his poison in her body since their honeymoon. She knew, Dr. Foster continued. By the time we identified the true nature of her condition, Eleanor had already done her own research. She knew about the biological weapons program, about your exposure in Vietnam, about what was happening to her body. Patricia's voice was barely audible. Why didn't she tell us? Because she loved you both too much to burden you with the truth. Eleanor spent her final months not fighting cancer, but documenting everything she could find about the program that had infected her. She contacted other military families, gathered evidence, built the foundation for the investigation that's happening now. Dr. Foster handed Patricia a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and bearing Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. She asked me to give this to you after her father learned the truth about his own condition. She said he would need to understand that none of this was his fault. Harold's hands shook as Patricia opened the letter, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't shed since Eleanor's funeral. His wife's voice seemed to speak from beyond the grave, each word carefully chosen to heal wounds that were about to be torn open. "My dearest Harry," Patricia read aloud, her voice breaking. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally come to light, and you know what really killed me. I need you to understand that I don't blame you, have never blamed you, will never blame you for what happened to us." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Eleanor's discovery of her condition, her decision to hide the truth to protect Harold's fragile mental state, and her determination to use her remaining time to help other families affected by the program. "You carried enough guilt from the war," Eleanor had written. "I wouldn't let you carry the guilt of my death as well, but I also couldn't let the people responsible escape justice. So I did what I've always done. I fought for our family, for our future, for the truth that sets us free." Harold collapsed into the chair beside Dr. Foster's desk, his body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. 46 years of marriage, and his wife had spent the last 6 months of her life protecting him from the truth that would have destroyed him. "There's more," Dr. Foster said quietly. "Eleanor established a trust fund, money she'd saved secretly over the years. She wanted it used to help other families affected by the program, to fund research into treatment options, to ensure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else." Patricia looked at the legal documents Dr. Foster provided, her eyes widening at the substantial sum Eleanor had somehow accumulated. "Where did she get this money?" "She'd been selling her paintings," Dr. Foster explained. "Eleanor was quite talented, though she never told anyone. She'd been quietly building this fund for over a decade, long before she became sick. It's as if she knew this day would come." The weight of Eleanor's sacrifice settled over Harold like a shroud. She had known about the biological weapons program for years, had prepared for the eventual exposure, had protected him while building the foundation for justice. Even in death, she was still fighting for him, still loving him, still trying to heal the wounds that the war had carved into their lives. "She left specific instructions," Dr. Foster continued. "The trust fund is to be administered jointly by you and Patricia, with the goal of supporting other veterans and their families affected by the program. Eleanor called it her final gift, the chance to turn your suffering into healing for others." Harold looked at his daughter through tear-blurred eyes, seeing Eleanor's determination reflected in Patricia's face. His wife had orchestrated this revelation, timing it perfectly to give them both a new purpose when their old lives had been destroyed. "She planned all of this," he whispered. "Even her death was part of the plan to expose them." Patricia took her father's hand, squeezing it with a strength that reminded him of Eleanor's touch. "She didn't plan to die, Dad. But when she knew it was coming, she made sure her death would mean something." As they left Dr. Foster's office, Harold felt something shift inside him. The guilt that had been eating him alive since Eleanor's death was still there, but it was joined now by something else. A sense of purpose that his wife had left for him to discover. Eleanor hadn't just died from the biological weapons program. She had died fighting it, and she had passed that fight on to him and Patricia. Her love had transcended death, transforming their tragedy into a weapon against the people who had destroyed so many lives. The war that had started in Vietnamese jungles 50 years ago was finally coming to an end, and Harold Mitchell was going to finish what his wife had started. 2 years after Eleanor's hidden truth emerged, Harold Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Ohio, his weathered hands gripping the podium as he looked out at an audience that included congressional representatives, veteran advocates, medical researchers, and families affected by the biological weapons program. The thin scar on his neck caught the stage lights as he leaned forward to speak, no longer hiding the mark that had become a symbol of survival and resistance. "My name is Harold Mitchell, and I'm here to tell you about the price of secrets," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had learned to speak truth, regardless of the cost. "For 50 years, I carried someone else's poison in my body. For 46 years, my wife carried it too, and she died protecting me from the knowledge that might have saved us both." The Eleanor Mitchell Foundation for Veterans Medical Justice had grown far beyond anything Harold could have imagined when he and Patricia first discovered the trust fund. What had started as Eleanor's secret savings account had attracted donations from across the country, funding medical research, legal assistance, and support services for the hundreds of veterans who had come forward with similar stories. Patricia sat in the front row, her own transformation as dramatic as her father's. She had closed her dermatology practice 6 months earlier to work full-time for the foundation, using her medical expertise to coordinate treatment protocols and advocate for comprehensive healthcare reforms. The professional distance that had once defined their relationship had been replaced by a partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect. "The government has acknowledged its wrongdoing," Harold continued, referencing the landmark settlement that had been announced just 3 weeks earlier. $4.7 billion in compensation for victims and their families, medical care for life, congressional oversight to ensure this never happens again. But money doesn't bring back the dead, and oversight doesn't heal the wounds that silence carved into our souls. In the audience, Harold could see faces he recognized from the growing community of survivors. Dr. Sarah Chen sat with her research team, their work having led to breakthrough treatments that had saved dozens of lives. Thomas Brennan occupied a seat in the back row, no longer the smooth-talking government operative, but a man whose cooperation with investigators had helped expose the full scope of the program. Brennan's transformation had been perhaps the most unexpected development in the entire saga. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of criminal prosecution, he had chosen to become a whistleblower rather than a scapegoat. His testimony before Congress had revealed decades of cover-ups, falsified medical records, and systematic abuse of military personnel who had trusted their government with their lives. "But I'm not here to talk about the past," Harold said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm here to talk about the future we're building together, the medical treatment center that will open next month in Eleanor's name, the scholarship fund for children of affected veterans, the research initiatives that are already showing promise for treating other victims of biological contamination." Mrs. Dorothy Chen had rejoined Harold's circle of friends, her earlier withdrawal now a source of shared embarrassment and understanding rather than lasting resentment. She had become one of the Foundation's most dedicated volunteers, organizing support groups for spouses and family members who struggled with guilt over their inability to recognize their loved ones' suffering. The community in Millbrook had undergone its own transformation, evolving from suspicious whispers to protective embrace as the full truth emerged. Harold's house had become an informal headquarters for the Foundation's local activities, with a steady stream of volunteers and visitors who brought casseroles, shared stories, and offered the kind of support that had been so conspicuously absent during the darkest days of the cover-up campaign. "My wife Eleanor used to say that love isn't the absence of pain, it's the courage to reach through pain toward something better," Harold continued, his eyes finding Patricia's face in the crowd. She spent her final months building bridges across the gulf of suffering, connecting families who thought they were alone with others who shared their burden. The Foundation's work had expanded internationally, connecting with similar organizations in other countries where biological weapons testing had occurred. The scope of the problem was larger than anyone had initially imagined, with evidence emerging of parallel programs in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Eleanor's vision of healing had become a global movement for accountability and justice. Harold's own healing had been gradual but profound. The nightmares that had plagued him since Vietnam had finally begun to fade, replaced by dreams of Eleanor working in her secret garden, not the vegetables and flowers she had grown behind their house, but the network of relationships and resources she had cultivated to ensure that truth would eventually triumph over deception. Physical therapy had helped restore much of the strength and mobility that the parasitic infection had stolen from him. More importantly, the sense of purpose that Eleanor had bequeathed to him and Patricia had given Harold a reason to fight through the pain and emerge stronger than he had been in decades. "They tried to use our love against us," Harold said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "They counted on our desire to protect each other, our willingness to suffer in silence rather than burden those we cared about. But they underestimated the power of love to transform suffering into action, silence into testimony, isolation into community." The standing ovation began slowly, with Dr. Chen rising first, followed by Patricia, then spreading through the audience like a wave of recognition and respect. Harold stood quietly at the podium, no longer the broken man who had awakened in terror at 2:17 a.m. 2 years earlier, but someone who had learned to carry his scars with dignity. As the applause continued, Harold's eyes went to the empty chair in the front row, the seat they always reserved for Eleanor at Foundation events. She couldn't be there to see what her sacrifice had accomplished, but Harold felt her presence as surely as he felt the warmth of the stage lights on his face. After the ceremony, Harold and Patricia walked together through the campus where Eleanor had once studied art, her secret talent finally receiving the recognition it deserved through a scholarship program for military spouses pursuing creative education. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you think she knew?" Patricia asked as they paused beside the memorial garden that bore Eleanor's name. "Do you think she could have imagined all of this when she started saving that money?" Harold considered the question, thinking about the woman who had loved him enough to carry his poison, who had died fighting a war she had never asked to join, who had orchestrated their victory from beyond the grave. "I think she knew that love doesn't end with death," he said finally. "I think she knew that if she could just keep us connected to each other and to the truth, we'd find a way to turn our pain into something that mattered." They stood together in comfortable silence, father and daughter united by loss and purpose, watching the first stars appear over the place where Eleanor's legacy continued to grow. The biological weapons program that had stolen so much from so many families was finally ending, but the healing it had made necessary would continue for generations. Harold Mitchell had learned to stop carrying other people's secrets. Instead, he carried Eleanor's love forward into a future where truth was stronger than fear, where community was more powerful than isolation, where the price of freedom was shared rather than borne alone. The war was over. The healing had just begun. Harold Mitchell's story isn't just about surviving biological warfare. It's about discovering that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths when we stop carrying them alone. Like Harold, many of us have spent decades protecting others from our pain, thinking that silence equals strength. We've watched marriages strain under unspoken burdens, seen relationships with our adult children fracture over misunderstandings we were too proud to address, and felt isolated in communities where we once belonged. but Harold's transformation reminds us that it's never too late to choose connection over isolation, truth over silence, and healing over hiding. At 67, this stubborn widower learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was the first step toward building something meaningful from his suffering. His daughter Patricia discovered that forgiveness could rebuild bridges that seemed permanently burned. Together, they turned their family's tragedy into a foundation that helped hundreds of other veterans find their way home. The most powerful moment in Harold's journey wasn't when he survived the surgery or won the legal battle. It was when he finally understood that Eleanor had loved him enough to carry his burden without complaint, and he chose to honor that love by refusing to carry anyone else's secrets. What burden have you been carrying alone that might become lighter if shared? Have you ever discovered that someone you love was protecting you from a truth you needed to know? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be the bridge someone else needs to find their way back to connection.